Hi, welcome to Deep Space Chats podcast with the Deep Space Initiative. So I'm Jen Fogarty. I'm the technical director for DSI, and I have a couple other jobs that you might learn about in some of the other podcasts, as well as my co-host, Dr. Serena Auñón-Chancellor. And we have a special guest today, Dr. Michaela Musilova, who has joined us, a very accomplished astrobiologist. And also, we're going to be discussing not only her technical expertise, but her role in analogs, isolation, confined, extreme analogs. And, Serena and I both come from the aerospace and NASA background, and we clearly understand and value the role of analogs to learn, the types of stressors and reactions that will happen with people over time. Exactly what risks are we looking at, and how do we understand and characterize them so we can prepare to mitigate them, and prepare to manage life for people when they leave our planet. It's very overwhelming at times to think about the complexity of doing a deep space mission. And I think the role of analogs in really understanding a variety of the dynamics as well as the interface between the human and the vehicle. And I've described this in the past that I think, we really should think of these vehicles that people will be on as exoplanets, consider they need to really be closed systems. So an incredible level of complexity there to consider. So I do think there's probably infinite number of things we can learn there, and we should learn there as we prepare to take these missions outside of low Earth orbit. So welcome, Dr. Musilova, to Deep Space Chats. How are you?
Hi there. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, we're excited to have you. So we want to hear a little bit more about you from you. So how would you like to help the audience understand a little bit about yourself?
So I do normally just introduce myself as an astrobiologist because it's a kind of all-encompassing term. On one hand, it kind of describes my passion for space and most importantly, looking for life in space. So hence the astrobiology, but it also kind of describes kind of my life and the work I've been doing so far, because it is about biology in space and not just looking for aliens, quote unquote, but actually helping us humans be able to live in space on other planets, like you were talking about, through analog missions. And basically, it's also about the spark that kind of got me on this journey when I was 8 years old to become an astronaut and be able to go to space myself and do the research there. Haven't gotten to that point yet, and my nationality, I'm from Slovakia, is unfortunately one of the reasons why it's been more difficult to become an astronaut, and maybe we can talk about that later. But definitely this passion for trying to find answers to questions about whether there is life out there, whether humans will be able to live on other planetary bodies, and where life came from here on Earth, or what has been motivating me throughout my life to do different types of research with NASA in extreme environments around the world. And then it led me ultimately also to leading over 30 simulated missions to the Moon and Mars, particularly at the High Seas facility in Hawaii that I was the director of until recently. And on top of that, I love doing outreach and educational work. I think it's really important for us scientists to share what we do with the public, make them understand why, or not make them, encourage them to understand why we do what we do, right, why it's interesting, and hopefully, motivate others to want to be involved in science, or just understand, how our world works and beyond. So that's why I do a lot of work with children around the world. I'm also a writer. I've written a couple of books, and just love communicating with people. So I kind of combine all of that with multiple projects and things. And these days I'm kind of my own boss in a way, where I lead a different number of projects, including one to climb the 7 summits, so the tallest mountain on each continent, while doing research and educational work along the way. And actually behind me on the picture is a Kilimanjaro that I climbed most recently as part of this project.
Wow, congratulations. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that very interesting background. And I think, your point of, and we'll touch on a lot of this, like diversity and inclusion, the idea that not everybody has the same opportunities, a lot of geographical barriers to that I think we have to very intentionally address, and there are efforts underway, but, they're always too little and not fast enough. So an effort actually, and it credit goes to Sarah Sabri, with an opportunity like Deep Space Initiative, is recognition that those limitations worldwide are extensive, and that there are very few outlets for people to engage. There's so much amazing talent out there, and people who are motivated and really dedicated to different technical areas that can contribute to human space exploration. But I think your point of the value back to Earth and the science communication that we in our roles, and that we can touch on like leadership in that area, have a responsibility to help explain to people and encourage them to engage in conversation and discourse about it, because I think there is a lot of misinformation, which is not uncommon, misunderstanding, or just lack, the lack of the context and lack of good dialogue. It's like, if it's not a 10-second soundbite, it didn't hit somebody's radar. And I think we have to keep hammering away at that and find ways. So congratulations to you. I think, the idea of being publicly available, in different platforms to encourage that sort of engagement, and just knowledge sharing, but really doing a variety of different mechanisms, like writing books, articles, doing education and outreach, touching children just to open their minds to the fact that this is a possibility, right? And not actually determine what the answer is. Like, that's not the goal. It's a journey versus an answer. So much appreciated and remarkable. So my first question for you is actually going to go back to, you mentioned like that key moment or moments when you're around 8 years old of making this choice of what you wanted for your future, but also helping us understand, because coming from Slovakia, as you said, it wasn't, and again, helping give, this is going to go out to a global audience, like in the United States. And I freely admit, like we take for granted the potential of opportunity being very available, right? Because you just don't have the perspective of the other side of this, which is you could be in a country where they don't have a space agency. They have limited number of, positions or opportunities in higher education that would lead to these other opportunities. So when you were 8 and you kind of got that spark about what you wanted to do, and then what did you do about it? Because obviously you had to be really incredibly deliberate about seeking out opportunity and taking risk.
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a complicated story, so I'll try and share it briefly. So yes, at first it was this spark, and sparks are really important, but they can also kind of die down over time. So in my life, it was important that there were multiple moments that kind of reignited that spark. And so the first one was actually just something as simple as I was bored in a supermarket waiting for my parents, and I started browsing through some kind of encyclopedia or some kind of book with information, let's put it that way. And there was a chapter about Jupiter's moons and also Saturn and how many rings they have. And for some reason, I found that fascinating, and I wanted to know whether life could exist on these planets and beyond our solar system. And that was really where that first moment of like wanting to know more, curiosity just beyond watching a movie, reading a book, but actually wanting to be more involved. That's where it all started. And then it turned into actually kind of combining my different passions into one. So I started writing small sci-fi novels. Of course, I was still a kid, so no, Shakespeare, but it was a combination of this search for life in space. I was writing about aliens that could potentially live on Jupiter and Saturn's moons and elsewhere. And it was combined with also a passion for fashion design. Actually, at the time, I also wanted to be a fashion designer. So I would design clothes for the aliens and draw them into these novels that I was writing, and then I shared them with my classmates. And that's kind of my way of taking on this new passion of mine, but still it wasn't very tangible at the time. And then a couple of years later, my father, he was a diplomat, and for a brief period of time we were in Washington, D.C. as part of his work. And he organized the meeting of our first and so far only astronaut, Ivan Bela, from Slovakia, and the last person to so far walk on the moon, Gene Cernan, because he has Czech and Slovak origin, or he had Czech and Slovak origin. So it was kind of a cultural meeting of astronauts, if you will. And just being able to meet these gentlemen inspired me, going like, oh wow, this is actually the perfect job for me, because I can look for life and, you know, go to space to do that as an astronaut. And so I was like, okay, this is definitely what I want to do. But then it occurred to me that actually it's very difficult to become an astronaut, and that actually even our first and only astronaut, Ivan Bella, he was able to go to space on a short mission thanks to a political exchange program, if you will, between Slovakia and Russia. And that's one of those things that don't, you know, happen very often. It wasn't for a space program of our own. And so I also realized how difficult this dream was, but I decided that it's something that I would really want to do, and that I was going to try and find a way to make it happen. And actually, one of my other inspirations was that I realized that there aren't many women, or there weren't many women astronauts, and to this day, there still aren't that many. And so I kind of wanted to prove to myself and to others that actually we women can do this too. And while I found both of those gentlemen fascinating, I think, you know, we should bring some more women into this sphere too. And so that was, again, another important moment that actually helped me define what I wanted to do. Big goal ahead of me, something I figured I would, you know, probably spend my whole life trying to achieve. But even then, unfortunately, it was still this kind of impossible dream, because Slovakia had absolutely no affiliation with the European Space Agency or any other kind of space program. We didn't have a space agency of our own. And that led to me kind of, in combination with other factors, starting to give up on that dream. Until I was 15 years old, I gradually kind of just filed that away and focused on other things. I'm very good at learning languages. I love culture history, thanks to my parents in particular, as my mother's an archaeologist, father was a diplomat. So we were really encouraged to dive deep into these kinds of topics as well. And so by the time I was 15, I was convinced I was going to be an art historian. And that, you know, I was kind of focusing on my strengths at the time, and thought I'll keep the space stuff as a hobby. And then another kind of important moment came that reignited the spark and really made me realize that actually I love science much more than any of those other things I thought I was good at. And that was actually a very simple thing of watching a movie. And I'm very grateful to my mom for encouraging me to watch this movie. It's called Aliens of the Deep. It's a documentary by James Cameron, where they go with astronauts and astrobiologists, the first time I heard that term, into the depths of oceans and find these amazing creatures that live there. And that movie came at a critical point, because I was in a French high school system at the time, and you had to choose a path, a scientific, social, economical, or a humanities type of track. And I was convinced to take one of the latter two and leave the science kind of, again, that's just a hobby. And the night before I had to make this decision, my mom happened to rent this movie, and she's like, oh, you're going to love this. You have to watch it. And even though I was busy with other things, I just put it on the background. And next thing I know, I was like sitting there right in front of the TV going, oh my God, this is exactly what I want to do. I also want to go explore these amazing creatures and find out if something else as equally extreme could live elsewhere in the universe. And that really is what changed everything for me, because I just realized that my passion and curiosity for science and space was much stronger than anything else. And I knew if I kind of sidetracked that, I would regret it for the rest of my life, and that the other things just wouldn't be as fulfilling. So that's when I decided to, okay, I'm definitely going to do this. I'm definitely going to try and find a way to do astrobiology and hopefully to get to space one day. And then I changed my whole life around that. So even in high school, I had several jobs to start basically saving money to be able to go to university. I knew I had to go abroad, at least to the UK, or ideally the US, in order to be able to study something to do with space. The US was too expensive, so I ultimately ended up applying to universities in the UK. I was able to get scholarships to go to University College London, but even then, it was a university, it was number 7 in the world or something like that at the time, in London, so a very expensive city. So even once I got there, I spent my entire undergraduate studies basically having multiple jobs while trying to get the best possible grades to get more scholarships. And it was a very difficult time for me, but I kept on telling myself that I'm doing it for the right reasons, that it's worth all that. And it ultimately helped me get a scholarship to go to Caltech in the US, worth $50,000. So unimaginable money for me. But it was thanks to being one of the top students in my university, and I won this special competition. And at Caltech, I was able to work with really experts in geobiology, astrobiology, all these topics that seemed intangible for so long, and suddenly they were there. I was even able to actually meet James Cameron, who was working with some of the scientists at Caltech on an Avatar movie. And so he came to give a presentation there, and I just decided I need to find a way to talk to him and basically thank him that in a way I'm here at Caltech and actually working for NASA thanks to his movie. So that was a nice little moment, kind of a full circle. And actually, even the work for NASA wasn't straightforward. As an international student, I wasn't allowed to work for NASA, but I had all these ideas on how to do astrobiology research, contacted a researcher there. He loved my ideas and my enthusiasm. And after 6 months of trying to find a way, we were able to apply for a grant, and I ended up working for NASA as a visiting researcher. So again, was able to find a way to make it happen despite the odds. And that's basically how it continued, that the rest of my life, and I don't want to spend this whole podcast just talking about what I did, but it was always about just trying to find a way, despite usually my nationality and finances being big issues, sure, and kind of a constant struggle, but it's one of those what doesn't kill you make you stronger sort of things.
It's really cool, because I'm so glad you shared that story, because I think a lot of times people believe we get opportunity dumped in our lap and there are no financial struggles with trying to get through school, and we didn't have to work weekend jobs to make ends meet and figure out what our next steps were going to be. And the struggle is there. I think, like you said, sometimes you just have to wait and find a way, but it was fascinating to hear you talk about these discrete time points that really kind of put you on your path. And I like to tell people, I call those time points opportunity. And opportunity isn't always necessarily this nice little package that's dumped into your lap. Sometimes it's a movie that you see, or a conversation, or something small that you just have to follow. So thank you for sharing that. That's I think that actually it was a very meaningful way to share your story with someone who may be exactly where you were many years ago, trying to figure out if the struggle is worth it.
Yeah, and the various crossroads, like you said, when you have varied interest and many talents, and you have these crossroad decisions, and they are opportunities. And I think you're going back to like kind of listen to your gut, you talk like where is that taking you in terms of you gravitating toward that movie on that day when you had to make the decision. And it was this reinforcement. There's a lot to unpack there too. We're both in I said leadership takes many forms. One of them is in a family as a parent. But the idea is whether it's influencing people, your children, other people's children, the people around you, your peers, even, just others who don't know, going back to that science communication, about what just offer it up, the exposure alone, and allow the person to get that exposure. So like with children, it's just like the more, the better. Like we don't need to architect who you'll be in the end, but we need to feed the idea that you could be any of these things, and you got to keep exploring. And I think your idea of the decisions we've all made are not risk-free, like to Serena's point, like I don't think anyone I know has had, an easy as a relative word, but it's like, but the persistence you had, like, and again, for all of our stories, there are those times when, you finally had to commit, and you were going to do things to make this happen, and you were still at risk for it not happening for a variety of reasons, like the vulnerability of it. And in particular, coming from a country that didn't have readily available. So you had to go, international to seek them. And in some ways, the technical aspects of relating to other government agencies and what you can and can't do, they're real. So we try to say, well, what are the real barriers, and what are the kind of the cultural barriers that, what can we break down, and what do we need help with? So that was an amazing story. And we're glad you made the choices you did, and brought you further along into supporting not only human spaceflight, but to me, this concept of how we're going to engage in the future, whether we talk about our own planet or surviving on another austere and extreme planet. I think people need to engage in this discussion, not as just science fiction, but the reality of the future of the generations. I think about telling people one of the best, the things that was handed down. It's an African proverb. And I said, people really have to remember, like, you were not promised this planet, by your parents. It's on loan to you by your children, right? So take care of it. And that concept of like being on loan to you, this is not yours. But,
Right.
That's where I really struggle with, how we communicate our science, because while we're doing these things to implement a future state, the immediate return to Earth is completely underestimated. And I guess that goes back to some of the science communication. So let's, I don't know, maybe dig into your first book, and the concept of when you decided to write that. And that's another one that takes a lot of discipline and deliberateness to sit down. I'm still bemoaning the need to write a paper, no less a book. So I would love to hear how you manage that and learn from you, for sure.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just quickly touch upon a point you made about parents, how important they are, and other role models. Because, my parents, on one hand, they were great at, if I had some fashion, so for space, they bought me a space book or lent it or something, I borrowed it from somewhere. But they just weren't able to help me financially. So they did what they could within their means. But then, they did tell me openly, if I want to pursue space and studies abroad, I have to basically finance all that myself. So sometimes, you can only do so much, but even those small things like the books and the movies and all that can, still make a huge difference. And that's why I think also the science communication is so important, like you mentioned as well. And that's why I do it. And that is also what led me to writing the book. But before I mentioned that, I might need to give you a little bit of a backstory so the book makes sense. The reason actually I wrote the book, and I was actually approached to write it by a publisher in Slovakia. And this was because I had spent, it's the year 2023 now. So over a decade, about 12 years or so, I've been doing science communication, not just in Slovakia, but around the world. And when I was approached to write this book 3 and something years ago, at that point, I had already kind of become something like the Neil deGrasse Tyson of Slovakia. And so it was basically, I didn't even want to write this book at first, but I was told that actually by sharing my story, part of which I shared with you, would actually help encourage other young people to take on difficult challenges and, do stuff that they're passionate about that maybe, their family can't support them in, or their surroundings aren't maybe that supportive of for whatever reason. And so it was actually this kind of wanting to share my story and help others what was my real motivation for the book. And this story itself is actually my biography in many ways, but it's a science communication book. It's called The Woman from Mars. And the reason it has this name is because I've actually been known in Slovakia as the Woman from Mars because of all my work and outreach activities related to Mars and astrobiology and simulated space missions, both to the Moon and Mars. And so the book is kind of my autobiography in a way, while trying to teach the audience something also about astrobiology and analog missions and the NASA environment and challenges along the way, so kind of a combination of the two things. And honestly, if it wasn't for the pandemic in 2020, I'm not sure I would have found the time to write a book. It definitely is something very challenging and time consuming. And I actually partnered up with a writer that I had worked with in the past. So it was a collaboration, the book. And the way it worked is at the time I was already in Hawaii leading the High Seas Research Station. And my co-author, she was in Slovakia. So exactly the other side of the world. And there were 12 hours between us. And I would wake up in the morning and we would have a call. And for about a couple hours, I would tell her my story. She would take notes. And it was like nighttime where she was. And eventually, after 6 months, we were able to kind of put this together into what became the book. I actually have it here next to me. So if you give me a moment, I'll just grab it.
Yeah, it's an exciting opportunity, I think, to reflect back on our biographies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there you can see it. It's in Slovakian.
Yeah.
So I'm actually currently working on the English version of it. And I don't want it to be a direct translation because it is tailored more to a Slovakian audience, and I want it to be more tangible for people all around the world. So that's why I'm kind of rewriting it myself this time. And there's a big focus on the analog missions that I've done so much of, because I feel like there's a lot we can learn from those missions and apply that to our everyday lives, not just to space exploration.
Yeah, so let's go there with your analog missions. So, I'm aware of Lunares as well as High Seas, and you have experience in a leadership role in both. So how did, I guess, from, the story as you told us, getting to Caltech and doing your fellowship, and then you moved on from there, and how did you connect to these analogs and find, that also being a significant part of your future path?
So it was another one of those opportunities where I decided to just go for it, even though the odds weren't necessarily in my favor. And that was after Caltech and NASA. I actually had to go back to Europe for visa reasons. I was only allowed to be in the US for a certain amount of time. I finished my master's at University College London, and I decided to do my PhD at the University of Bristol. There are many reasons for that. One of them was that I focused on life in extreme environments, so-called extremophiles, for my research. These are the same kinds of extremophiles that I saw in the movie Aliens of the Deep. So amazing creatures that live in what are extreme environments to us, what is home to them. And these are the same kinds of creatures we're hoping to find on other planetary bodies, on Mars and elsewhere. And so my focus was on that, and I found that some extremophiles, for example, those that I was studying in Greenland beyond the Arctic Circle, they can not only survive in these extreme environments, but they can produce a lot of organic matter, something that actually we could use to fertilize soils. And around that time, there was a call for the first British crew to go on an analog Martian mission at the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah. Though I'm not British, I still decided to apply for this because I was studying at a British university. I was a British student, and I had a bunch of research work that I was doing in the UK. So I was hoping that maybe we could find a way to make it work. And luckily, I was accepted both to be an analog astronaut on the crew, the head of research for that particular mission, but also my 3 different research projects were accepted as well. And so that's where I was kind of able to bridge my fascination with extremophiles, astrobiology, into this whole analog world, because I used these extremophiles to see if we could fertilize simulated Martian soil. And it actually worked. That even though these extremophiles are used to very cold temperatures in the Arctic, under certain circumstances with the right kind of nudge, quote unquote, or stimulation, they're actually able to produce a lot of organic matter and make certain soils be fertile, which is something we're definitely going to use in the future once we're going to want to live on the moon, Mars, and elsewhere. And that was kind of my first, my foot in the door into this analog world, and it went really well. The research worked out, and I knew that, okay, this is actually a great opportunity for me to test a lot of my research and make this space connection again through future analog missions. I didn't quite know how to go about doing it, but because my research went so well, I was actually later approached to be the commander of another mission at the Mars Desert Research Station a few years later. And it kind of became a pattern where I would do some research and then somehow I'd be approached to be part of a mission, or actually for High Seas, I was selected by a NASA University of Hawaii collaboration to be part of an 8-month simulated mission at High Seas. And that's ultimately what got me into that position in the first place. But I'll just mention that in the meantime, after my PhD, I actually decided to go back home to Slovakia. I thought if there's a time in my life to go back home and try and kind of share my knowledge and experience with my country, that was the time, not maybe later in life when I'm already established somewhere else. So I decided to kind of take a tangent, went home to Slovakia, and I tried to push the space sector forward. And thanks to the work of my colleagues and I from the Slovak Organization for Space Activities, we built the first Slovak satellite. We started up a space engineering degree program at a university in Slovakia that I'm still a professor at to this day. I started teaching astrobiology, and we were able to convince the government to sign a cooperation agreement with the European Space Agency. And now a few years later, actually Slovakia is an associate member of ESA. That means that in the future, when there's going to be a selection round for astronauts, Slovakians will actually be able to apply for the very first time. So it was definitely worth going back home and kind of getting the ball rolling on this. But at the same time, when I was selected for this NASA mission in Hawaii, I felt like I needed to go for that. It was a very difficult decision for me because at the time I was already in Slovakia, established. I was head of Slovakia's space organization, not quite space agency, but the closest to it at the time. I was a professor, I had a bunch of students, and I just started up my first space startup company. And so to leave all that and to pursue what I considered a more selfish dream was very difficult. And so I made the most of it. I tried to set up a system where everyone would be fine without me in Slovakia. And so I could pursue something for myself more selfishly. But I hope that some way that would be able to give back to my home country later. And so it was a very tough decision, and I felt extremely guilty about it. It took me like almost a year to get over that guilt. And it was made even worse by the fact that actually that simulated mission didn't go according to plan. It didn't end up being 8 months at all. For various reasons I'm not going to go into right now, but unfortunately the mission was cut short because of an accident that happened to a crew member. And then it was just decided that it's better if the mission is stopped rather than trying to pursue it or restart it. And I was left in a difficult catch-22 kind of position because I was in the US on a special visa to do this mission. And I was told that there would be another mission later in the year. So if I wanted to pursue that mission, I would have to find a way to extend my visa, stay in the US longer, and then try again for another mission. Otherwise, the other option was to go home, but then my visa would end and I would not be able to go back to the US for another 2 years under this kind of visa. And I thought to myself, oh, who knows what's going to happen in 2 years' time? It was too risky to just give up on it. So while everyone was calling me to go back home to Slovakia to kind of continue with everything else I had going on, I again felt like if I don't try and find a way to make this work, I'm just going to completely give up on it. It's just not going to happen ever. And so I reached out to everyone in my space community. It was very desperate. I had like 2 weeks to extend my visa, which is basically mission impossible. But I was very fortunate that actually on the same island that I was on, the big island of Hawaii, the Canada-France-Hawaii telescope, I needed an astronomer to analyze some NASA data they had. And they were able to extend my visa for 6 months to work on this project while I was waiting for another mission to start. And it was, almost unbelievable for me that it worked out like that last minute. And I almost considered it as a sign that, okay, it was worth it, that I should stay in the US and pursue this. In the meantime, various things happened. While waiting for this other mission to start, I started actually talking to the owner of the high seas facility. He built the station, owns it to this day, but NASA and the University of Hawaii were basically renting it from him to do the simulated space missions. And I was telling him, well, no missions are happening. Why doesn't he organize missions of his own? He always wanted to do lunar missions and lunar-based research. So I actually helped him come up with simulated lunar missions while waiting for a NASA Mars mission to restart. But then an article came out in the Atlantic about our mission. It was one of the crew members that stepped away. They decided to talk to the media about what happened. And it basically made NASA, I imagine, in part decide to not pursue these missions anymore. So the whole reason why I stayed in the US for 6 months longer suddenly crashed and burned and was clearly not going to happen anymore. And I thought, okay, well, I guess that's it. I'm going to go back home. I tried my best, but there's nothing more I can do. And that's when the owner of the high seas facility was like, well, no, I really love your ideas. Let's make this all happen. Why don't you stay and become the director? And that's basically to finish that story. That's how I ended up in Hawaii. And since 2018, I ran over 40 simulated missions to the moon and Mars there, led over 30 of those missions, and definitely learned a lot and didn't see that coming at all.
So, wow. I'm just going to say, wow. First of all, I'm going to go back to when you went home to Slovakia and accomplished. Can I ask what time frame that was in that you accomplished all these different activities and, purposes that you had set out for your country. How long a time period was that?
2.5 years.
Wow. Okay. So I can imagine that was difficult after you kind of come home to your roots and then have to pull those roots up again and go back to pursue your dream. I love analog environments, and you are by far one of the most experienced analog astronauts I've ever met. And so I'm going to dive into the analog part just a little bit more, because clearly you've been through multiple types of analog environments. And a question I get asked a lot on station is, tell me the challenges about being a woman on station. And so I'm going to throw the question back over to you and say, did you experience any differences or challenges? Is that a question we still need to be asking? And would love to hear you talk about that a little bit, because I get pummeled with that question no matter where I go. So I can't wait. It's the first time I've been able to throw it over the fence to somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, it is unfortunately still an issue. I think nowadays I'm in a better position where I don't feel like I'm treated too differently as a woman commander of a mission than I was in the past. And I think it's thanks to a lot of lessons learned along the way. So when I think back to my first expeditions to the Arctic, I was 21 and still kind of figuring out even how to work in a team well. And then when I had to lead a team into extreme conditions on glaciers, now when I think back, I'm like, yeah, I definitely didn't go about the right way. And I think I was just simply too nice. I felt like it was asking a lot of my team to help me with things. So I felt like I had to roll over and give them everything they wanted in exchange for a little bit of help. With hindsight, that's what they signed up for, and I was helping them with other things. I shouldn't have felt so guilty and the need to just make them happy all the time just because they're helping me a little bit with something. And I think for a long time, I wasn't able to find the right balance of leading a team without worrying that I'm being too strict, too demanding, and a lot of those negative things that tend to get associated with female leaders. And if anything, when I was more myself, I felt like my niceness, my empathy, or my compassion for people was always taken advantage of. And so I almost try to push that to one side and almost become someone else to be taken more seriously, mostly by men in a team. And it wasn't until the missions at high seas that I actually realized how important it is to be empathetic, to have that compassion, to use those things I thought were weaknesses actually as strengths. And now when I lead a team, I lead with that. And it helps me create a much better, happier environment for the entire crew and myself. And now I know that that's actually one of the best ways to lead a team. And even though, yes, there are still some people, especially men, that would think that weird and would think that that's not a good way to do it and might give me some resistance. I definitely get actually much less resistance these days than I did in the past. So I think it's a combination of figuring out what my strengths were and using them the right way, but also having the confidence of knowing I know how to lead a team. Like, I've done this many times. I shouldn't let people's kind of doubts of a woman in leadership kind of make me doubt myself more. So it was a kind of a learning lesson throughout the years, observing how my behavior reflected on other people, what I should change for the better, and what things maybe I shouldn't actually change, and that they were just kind of being imposed on me stereotypically that, oh, you need to be like this to be a leader. But actually there's many ways of being a leader, and sticking to your principles and to who you are is what I found the best way, at least for me.
Yeah, I think that's, self-awareness, right? And your own maturation process, and forgiving yourself that you don't have to be perfect. Like there's no such thing. But this idea of there's this archetype, and it tends to be, the male leader as some archetype. Not that history isn't full of strong women leaders that had other characteristics. So we need to remember those, and remind, like there's different styles. And I think what you're pointing at you do sometimes have to be, I think, a little different depending on what your people need, right? That's the empathy factor. Like you can, when you need to be stern, direct, organized, and they need what they don't need is doubt, right? And you project that confidence, whether you have, like it was like fake it till you make it, because a lot of us are just, the whole idea is, courage is fear that has said its prayers, right? It's not that fear isn't there. You got to do it anyway. And you got to take these people with you and you lead from the front. But there's an element, then there are times where it's appropriate to be more vulnerable with them and, offer them things that they need to help them do their jobs, So I think that it is not, again, it's not one or two dimensional, the experience or the learning of it or the implementation of it. So Serena, how does that parallel? Like, there's a lot of different times, in your different missions, which you've done things that were more analog, like in your training and leadership training, versus your experience going into space and then supporting a mission, and part of that mission being science and research.
Yeah.
The complexity of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Michaela, I loved, when we all start out and we have very little experience in certain areas, I think we are quite naive and we do the best we can. And we try and follow this archetype of how maybe a leader or a follower should be. And we do focus about a lot of that on station, because you've got folks, 6 folks flying together that can all be leaders, but it's being very self-aware and aware of the mission and your crew around you and recognizing who may be the best to lead in the circumstance. It may not be the commander in certain scenarios. And I feel like, the folks I flew with had a very good sense of that. But, you mentioned self-awareness, and that is probably still one of the biggest keys that I would throw out there to a successful mission, because the moment you begin to ignore certain signs, either in yourself or you don't recognize that in your team, Michaela, I think you talked about it several times. I think you were able to recognize when maybe your team wasn't doing as well, or really just kind of project very early. And so you were able to force feed them what they needed to keep that mission going. And it takes special talents to do that. So I was really happy to hear that in your extensive analog experience, it's so similar to station. I really feel like the analogs, and I only took part in 2 really, one being Antarctica and the other being Nemo, really were just the best mimickers of being in space and being isolated and being in an extreme environment. And I learned so much about myself more than anything else. It was, how did I do in those very isolated, extreme environments? Where were my downfalls? Where were my weaknesses? And it does help you be a better leader. So I appreciate that discussion.
Yeah, even that what you described when you had to make the decision to leave Slovakia to go to the high seas mission, you were a leader in your country, a role model, and that concept, because it was an investment in doing this other thing, and that's kind of that tension of, I've got these choices. They are all very important. Why now? Why this versus that? And some people, going back to like, other people will disagree with you vehemently, right? or be hurt by it. They take it very personally. All these emotions are coming out, and being able to read other people and manage yourself and get them what they need while you're still making progress. It's a delicate balance of things. And there are different styles. And I still go back to like, in various leadership roles I've had, not everybody has appreciated my style. And I was like, that's okay. Like there are choices for you as well.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
And I've had to be okay. It's like, and Serena, I think Dr. Mike Barrett, another colleague of ours who has a lot of experience, like, you got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yep.
And that just let it go, like don't, I know I beat myself up, especially when I was young, like you just relive that scenario of whatever went on when you felt you disappointed someone because their projection back at you was you made a wrong choice compared to what they wanted or needed. And at some point you're like, I heard you, I understand. we're moving forward. Whatever, we're gonna go now.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, I think the analogs really have served a role because we've tried to use those as places where we can learn these things, not because they're not important and they're doing research themselves. You said like the extremophile work, but for spaceflight, the issues when they manifest could more likely be catastrophic. The idea is like in a high seas or lunares, or the exception, we get into these things called isolated, confined, and controlled versus isolated, confined, and extreme. And there's a large spectrum of what extreme might mean, but a lot of those are, the mission can come to an end. And I think the 8-month mission for high seas was one of those. And I'm familiar with, some of the details. And but it wasn't that the accident, like had medical issues associated with it. But the idea of the mission ending was not life-threatening to you and your other crewmates, right? You can walk off, the facility and you're okay. Whereas in space, when stuff like that happens, you have the vacuum of space around you. The alternatives are not as luxurious as, and I'm not saying that the lava field is luxurious, but like, this is where I try to, like, this is why we do this stuff on Earth and really try to understand these dynamics. These are operations, like even Antarctic, like these people are doing jobs and we study how they do their jobs as teams and as isolated, and it is extreme. And it's very important, but there's still a rich source of us understanding how people interact, who becomes the leader, the follower, how the relationships come together, how do they fall apart, and where do people go with that, particularly behaviorally, and how do they act out? So can we get some line of sight of how to detect these things and help people become more acutely self-aware, and then also give them action? Like, what do you do about it when you feel this way and you've only got 5 feet to get away from the person that's getting on your nerves? And you're going to have to look at them tomorrow. Like, you don't get the break, you don't have your other kind of mechanisms that you would use to control yourself. So they're incredibly valuable. So you have now had, like you said, not only have you been in missions and been commander, but you've overseen 30 missions, more than 30 missions. So you've seen a lot of the different combinations of people and these scenarios play out while they're doing work. So, where do you want to take it from here? Like, where do you see this future going? I mean, incredibly accomplished and, a champion for the field of aerospace and space research in Slovakia. And I think you've really cracked the nut when you talk about what you were capable of doing with your ESA relationship so that the Slovakians can apply to be ESA astronauts. That I did not know. And I think that's a phenomenal, phenomenal accomplishment among many of yours. But yeah, where's your trajectory now?
Yeah, good question. So I think one thing to note is that, yes, we've observed a lot of very interesting things over these many missions, and a big part of it is exactly what you were both talking about. We learned so much about human interactions. And for me personally, one of the most important things that I observed and learned was how important diversity is. When we first started, a lot of the missions were following certain rules, and let's just say most of the people that were selected were scientists, engineers, maybe doctors, usually from the US for whatever reason. And then with time, it was my goal to open up the facility to the world and to get more diverse crews, and not just in terms of their ethnicity and color and all that sort of stuff, but also in terms of their area of expertise. So not just scientists and engineers and doctors, but to add someone with a different perspective to the crew who can actually help change things up. And most importantly, if there's a problem, they can provide this other point of view and potentially help us find a solution. But also we can all learn from this person because they literally shuffle around the way we think and work. And so I started doing more and more of that. And the results were amazing. The more diverse the crews I had, the better the mission went. We all learned something from each other. We all started to be more introspective, realizing, what differences there are between us culturally, between genders and all these things. And even the diversity in terms of our areas of expertise. A lot of people tend to be on a high horse about, I did X many years at NASA or here or there. And then, when they have someone come in that has very different experience, doesn't have a PhD, but did some other kind of work, they don't always look at them as their equal. But actually during these missions, they realize what value these people bring to the team and how actually they can be even more useful than the engineer in certain situations, just as an example. So it was very eye-opening for me, but I think for the teams, and as a commander, I always strive to make us become more of a family than just a team of professionals working together, which is what a lot of analog missions are like. If the commander, male or female, if they have a certain way of running the missions, then yeah, it's just a bunch of professionals working together for X many weeks or months trying to achieve something to do with the mission, but they don't develop stronger relationships in a kind of family-like environment. But that means if something bad happens, the arguments tend to be much more intense. They tend to have trouble forgiving each other, moving on. And most importantly, they also don't try and make each other as happy as they could. And whereas in these more kind of family type environments I was trying to create at high seas, if someone was having a bad day, people would come give them hugs, would bake a cake for them, or do something to cheer that person up and make, therefore, everyone feel happier. And people opened up and were able to communicate. And that's another thing I found to be extremely important during these missions, is people really need to not only be able to communicate amongst themselves and be polite and empathetic and all that, but also to communicate what they are feeling and their needs to the others, which a lot of people are not good at. And then again, something bad happens, they have a bad day, and then people don't really know how to help them, how to react, and that tends to escalate. So all these things I personally learned, and I hope that a lot of my now former crew members learned, were thanks to kind of opening up their minds to how important being different and having different people in your team is. And I think they left the station hopefully being able to implement all those things into their day-to-day lives. And that's now one of my current goals through the outreach that I do, and the book I'm currently writing, is to show this, how important it is to be empathetic, to communicate well, and to embrace diversity, include it in our lives in as many ways as possible, and be more tolerant towards other people. And it's not just good for space missions, but really it can change the way we live in this world and make it better for future generations, kind of like you were talking about, having our time on this planet kind of on loan and making it a better place for our children, which is particularly difficult these days with climate change and politics and all those things. And that is also actually what led me to my current Astro 7 Summits project, where I'm bridging important topics of climate change and the future on Earth with our future in space too.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you really summed up the humanity of these missions, whether it be, analog, these workplace endeavors, special ops missions, and extreme exploration missions on Earth, but even as Serena experienced, space flight in low Earth orbit. And now we're clearly planning on, in the very near future, moving past low Earth orbit, a whole nother set of challenges, slightly different. But that the recognition in this big engineering construct, when you send humans, you have got to recognize and be respectful of the humanity that they're going to need to do this thing and be productive, stay healthy and be productive. The data, to the other aspect of the value of the analogs is while you were commenting on what you've learned and what the individuals, probably took away and can be better for, the work that's going on behind the scenes, these publications support that the data is showing. So if people, I make data-driven decisions, that's my whole check. Like, these are knowable things, and they're very technically hard to quantify, measure. I mean, we can all debate the metrics and specifics, but overall, no matter how you slice and dice, and I was thinking the work of whether it be Sandra Whitmire or Laura Landon on leadership and team, that the information coming out defends all of that. Like what we know, from living it, is mirrored in the data. And so it strongly says these are not myth and legend. Like having diversity in the crew, being respectful of other people's emotions, being self-aware enough to understand how someone else might be feeling about things and respond to that. And then also the concept of the little things. I think the idea of recognizing if someone's having a hard day, in terms of if we're just working and we're just colleagues, I'm going to put the blinders on and I'm not going to not care that you're having a bad day. You just got to do your job. But the idea is, in order for you to do your job well and come back tomorrow and want to come back and do this hard job again, or whatever it is, just offering you a peace sign, whether it be a cake, a cupcake, a little note. My thing with my friends, because we're all so disparately located, you might appreciate this, is sending them Instagram memes. Just these little snippets of, and they're just silly ones. Like this is the sillier the better, but it's just that touch of humanity that says, all these weird things happen to all of us. I don't care if you're the president of the United States or Slovakia.
Yep.
But everybody thinks it's super cute when the puppy dogs come in and do crazy things. And you just need that moment of recognition, like, I'm a human again. Someone cared enough to send me even a moment, just that brief connection. And we have, as much as we could dog social media and everything else we want, like you've got this superpower, you got to use it for good, not evil.
Yeah.
And I just like that snippet of that idea of baking somebody a cake. You're like, people be like, what the hell's going on in that analog? And they're baking cakes for each other. But if that held the crew together, because it could turn the whole attitude around, like, oh, you actually care. Like, it's not just me being a cog in this wheel. I'm not a cog, right? I'm an integral part of this team. And if I don't work, it doesn't work. And I think in life, not underestimating those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a cool way to wrap up, because I really like the idea of recognizing those things and the importance of them, and making sure that's somehow we can write here, we'll engineer it for you. Somehow we're going to have to write a requirement to reflect the ability to do nice things for people while you're on these missions. So we make sure we enable that, because that's what gets left out when you build the thing. We've been on the side of that, whether it be the new analog, but you're like, no, I want to build in the capability to have some reserve. And we can touch on in a future podcast. We'll have you back, because I want to pull on something you're talking about, which is emotional and psychological reserve and resilience. And that is the concept of doing a nice thing for someone is a countermeasure, because someone else recognized they needed that thing, the thing they may not even have known they needed. And you could take the moment to know that. And that's recognition of each other's humanity, which I think is a lost value.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And that's kind of what I was also touching upon earlier when I mentioned, like those are things that were always important to me. But when I was younger, I was made to feel like it's a weakness to care about others, try and make them happy, or share how I'm feeling. I'm having a bad day. This is not about you. Please don't take it personally. I just, something came up. And just unfortunately in the past, the mostly male dominated teams I was in, or, again, it could be a cultural thing, whatever, it made me feel like that was a weakness, a bad thing. And with time and actually being true to myself and, trusting my instincts that actually it is the right thing to do now, to do these nice things for other people, it will not be seen as a weakness. Instead, it will show that I care. It will create a stronger relationship. It will allow them to open up as well, and for us to have a solid foundation to not just a working environment and relationship, but actually something stronger than that. Those are all great and important things. And so now I lead with that, but it took years of experience and trial and error and building my own confidence to stick to my gut and trust it and be more humane, which, as you said, unfortunately is not always emphasized or looked for when analog astronaut selections are made, maybe even real astronaut selections and other kinds of selection programs. And I do love talking about it, and I hope that people will realize with time just how important it is, especially for long duration space missions.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, at NASA, we call it expeditionary behavior. It's expected on missions. So it's, I love hearing you talk about it, because I realize the challenges that you face very early on. And, I flew with all men, 5 men and myself, and they were some of the best. I guess they recognized their own behavior, but then also knew when someone wasn't doing well. And we weren't really able to bake a cake up there. That would have been cool, but you could make a very nice instant cappuccino. And so that kind of sufficed as, I know you're having a bad day, here you go. But
that's
it's
wonderful.
Nice. Yeah. And so but I do think that a lot of your work done in the past leading towards that has helped NASA get to that point,
Oh,
right?
sure.
To understand the importance. So
Yeah, and I'd say that the word that comes to mind is very authentic leadership. That was the other thing that makes you the better leader, because you, what you're describing, Michaela, was, as you matured, being comfortable with what your strengths were, even though the outside influence was maybe marginalizing that or dismissing that because it didn't exist. But you're like, well, you can't, if you try to suppress those in yourself, one, it makes you miserable, right? Because you're going counter to who you authentically are. That's a lot of work. And we can talk all about how that drains you and the energy swamp that is. But then realizing, I think it's so powerful as you're talking about that, is actually the strength. And it's a strength that's often missing if you go over this other way, to this other archetype, which the data doesn't support and history doesn't really support. But it was the typical, suck it up, don't cry, all these things. And those strategies can work for tiny amounts of time, when you talk about like sortie missions. But once you start going the marathon route, like the cracks are going to show pretty quickly that is not a sustainable model and probably not a good one to begin with. And the data all supports that, which maybe we should write a paper.
I've never heard that term. I have to be honest. I love it though. It's perfect.
Really?
Authentic leadership. No,
yeah,
I've never heard it, but I think that's what we all strive for. I've never put that in that term.
Yeah. And except that it's a little different. Like, again, it's not, there's not one way, right? And we even, you can tweak yourself every day, it's what the team needs, what you need, but overall you have this composite thing that you feel very comfortable with and you can execute very well. You're very consistent. That's the other part of, if you are kind of all over the place when you're trying to run a team, I think, and Michaela used the word before, like it reflects back to you. You're like, if chaos is happening, maybe it's my fault. Like, and that's a self-aware thing. Like, what am I doing? And I only control me. So let me get a handle on this. And if I'm not being authentic, maybe I'm just changing too much because I'm always sorting out like, well, who do I need to be? But it's an amazing opportunity that we have to explore these things. And, cool. We coined the phrase authentic leadership. And
awesome.
I like it.
We'll start getting some characteristics out there and getting the data that supports it, piecing it together. And the women I mentioned, do it for a living amongst a lot of other people, but those are the ones I know. And I have highly valued the research coming out of analogs to help inform that. And Serena's exactly correctly. Those same people work with the operations community that say like, these may be things you thought were happening. Here's the data to support that or refute that. And then what do we do about going forward? But I think the expeditionary behavior and the recognition for long duration, extreme expeditionary missions require people who have these behaviors and can get there together. So, well, this was amazing. I really enjoyed learning about you and your success. Yeah. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. And
of course, it was wonderful talking to you both.
Yeah, it was.
This was great.
Welcome to the community.
Thank you.
Can't wait to have you back.
Yeah, exactly.
My pleasure.
Expect an invitation. We'll put some topics together in the future. So, well, happy New Year and wishing you the best in 2023 and excited to see your new book soon.
Thank you very much. Happy New Year to you both. And I can't wait to talk to you again soon.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us on Deep Space Chat Podcast with DSI. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Michaela.
Bye. Thank you both.